Appreciate you coming. So my name's Lauren Hierl, and I'm the executive director of Vermont Conservation Voters. And we were striving with these morning sessions to just provide a brief overview of issues that we know are likely to come before you all, with legislation that we know is pending and issues that you might be interested in learning more about before you potentially are taking a vote or wrestling with it in committee. So sharing our perspectives and background on why we're prioritizing these issues. And the last week we did one on weatherization. So there's a 20-minute video that goes into weatherization. So if that comes up as an issue and you want to learn more, that's available. So what we're going to do this morning, I'm going to turn it over to Jon Groveman from the Vermont Natural Resources Council, who's going to give an overview of kind of the state of the state on toxic chemical regulations, and one of the bills that has been before the legislature the last couple sessions and is likely to come up again, which has to do with medical monitoring for people exposed to toxic contamination. And then Marcie Gallagher of the Vermont Public Interest Research Group is going to discuss a bill that addresses PFAS, these chemicals that are linked to a range of health issues in certain products like food packaging, carpets and rugs, firefighting foam. And then Jen Duggan of the Conservation Law Foundation is going to talk a little bit about, and these will all be brief so we can keep you on time and get you out and have time for your questions, is going to talk about PFAS in drinking water and surface water and what is happening with there. So I'm going to now just turn it over to Jon and we will kick it off. Thank you so much again for being here.
So I'm Jon Groveman. I'm the VNRC Policy and Water Program Director. Thank you very much for making the time to hear about these issues. I'm going to go through this pretty quickly and give really a thumbnail sketch of this issue. It's a complicated issue, like most of the issues that you deal with are. So, ask questions today, and please feel free to reach out to us after this with any questions. And as these bills start to move, we'll reach out to you and your colleagues. So, medical monitoring. So what are we talking about? What is this all about? So when toxic chemicals are released into the environment, they can cause significant harm to the environment and human health. It's no surprise. I think everybody knows that. We've always been concerned about the release and management of toxic chemicals. The release in Bennington in 2015 really put a focus on these issues in a lot of different ways. In fact, all the different bills you're going to hear about this morning, our efforts to deal with these issues has been significantly heightened by what happened in Bennington with the release of PFAS chemicals. One of the issues that came to the fore from the situation in Bennington, though, is that the toxic chemical release, obviously, it caused actual significant harm to people down in Bennington. It caused harm to people's health. Their drinking water wells were contaminated. People became sick, very sick, with serious diseases. Property, soils became contaminated. Property values plummeted. And one of the, in addition to the regulatory actions that the Agency of Natural Resources has taken, and in addition to our efforts to improve the laws to give government more authority to hold polluters accountable and to prevent and mitigate damage from toxic releases, there are obviously the court system is a big part of how people hold polluters responsible, become whole, get relief from a release that basically somebody caused and harm to people's health and their property, as I mentioned, that people need to be able to recover damages and hold liable these companies in court. And so there are, as a result of the Bennington release, there is a lawsuit in Bennington in federal court against the owner of the facility that released the chemicals that caused this harm. Saint-Gobain is the owner currently, and they're the main defendant in the suit. And so as the lawyers for the victims in Bennington started to put their case together, it was clear, and this happens every time there's a release of toxic chemicals, that there was a segment of people who were exposed to the high levels of PFAS released from the facility, they had really high levels in their blood, higher than of PFAS. They went to the doctor, they were tested, their levels were off the charts, 100, 500, thousands of times higher than what health experts and government regulators would recommend is a safe level for these chemicals in your body. We all have some level of these chemicals in our body because they're so ubiquitous. You'll hear, I think, more about that from Marcie and from Jen. But these levels were off the chart. And so one of the parts of that lawsuit in Bennington was, well, there are some people who have high levels, but they're not sick yet. They haven't gotten terrible diseases like cancer or autoimmune diseases, like diabetes and neurological disorders. But they're at high risk for them, and they need to go to the doctor very frequently for testing to see if they get these diseases, catch them early, and give these people as much help as possible. And so one of the claims in the lawsuit was for these medical monitoring costs. So that's what medical monitoring means, is being able to sue for medical monitoring costs when you've been exposed to these chemicals, have these high levels in your body, but you haven't yet contracted the disease. And what the victims in Bennington found out, and what their lawyers already knew when they put together the suit, was Vermont did not recognize these medical monitoring claims. Vermont, like most states, said until you actually get sick, you can't sue whoever was responsible for releasing the chemicals for causing you harm. You have to wait till you get sick. There are approximately 18 to 20 states where federal courts have allowed for this sort of medical monitoring remedy. It was not allowed in Vermont. So we put together a bill, actually twice before, to basically close this gap in the law, to in statute say that people harmed by these releases and who have these high levels but have not yet contracted a disease, they could sue to be made whole and hold the polluters responsible for putting them at risk for getting a serious disease. It was a really important step forward. We felt this bill to help victims of toxic pollution, hold polluters accountable. Vermont would also be the first state to put this remedy in statute. And there are several other states looking at this. And I think, we felt it would be really important and this is where we're headed. States are going to adopt these sort of medical monitoring causes of action, but Vermont would be the first. So we thought that was important, but it also made the bill, as you know, whenever you're first, I don't know if controversial is the right word, but there's more attention paid to going first. Twice a bill that provided this medical monitoring cause of action passed. Twice the governor vetoed it. Last legislative session, we were one vote shy of overriding the veto in the Senate, and we were working on getting a veto override vote with the Senate leadership, and the pandemic hit. And obviously that, took precedent over everything, made it very difficult to focus on this issue. And the Senate there was never an override vote held, I think in large part because of the pandemic and all the challenges that are obvious and you're still dealing with today. While we were also, something happened last year where in that Bennington case that I mentioned, the federal judge did, in preliminary motions that were filed, ruled that the plaintiffs in that case, the victims of the pollution, they could try to make the case for medical monitoring. He was not going to dismiss their claim for medical monitoring. They said, we'll go to trial, you can put on your evidence, and you can try to convince me, the court, to grant this remedy. And here's the test I'm going to use to evaluate your claims at trial. This is really a preliminary ruling. It will be appealed if it becomes a final ruling, and the court case will go on for years and years and years. So the judge's ruling doesn't clear up the issue, but it did give an indication of how a Vermont court might look at the issue. And the judge in that case is Judge Crawford, because you may hear about the Crawford test. He, all these, most of these civil litigation liability issues have a test that you have to meet in order to be awarded damages. And so he set out a test for medical monitoring that was a little bit different than the test in the medical monitoring bill. And one of the arguments that the governor made in vetoing the bill and industry made was that the test was too favorable to victims of pollution. It would be too easy to win medical monitoring. Don't have time to go into that right now, but we dispute that. Vigorously is not a word that really characterizes how much we dispute that. It's never easy for victims of pollution. They're always on the short end of the stick. They're fighting giant corporations who always have the upper hand. So we did not agree that the test was easy or too favorable to victims of pollution. But nonetheless, hearing what the governor said and really wanting to pass a bill that helps victims of toxic pollution in Vermont, we've worked on a bill to basically change the test for medical monitoring to make it more like Judge Crawford's test in his preliminary ruling in that Bennington case, hoping that this will allay some of the governor's concerns and we could actually get a bill that we can sign and help Vermonters. I believe that bill will be introduced soon. I think it will be introduced in the Senate. And I believe that you will, see that bill maybe by the end of this year, or, certainly for the next biennium. And we, will be advocating for a passage of the bill. We think it would really help people. So that is medical monitoring.
So next up, we're going to have Marcie Gallagher from VPIRG, and she's going to talk about a bill that has to do with regulating toxic chemicals in products. And this is something, just really briefly, before Marcie goes into the details of that, this is something that Vermont as a state has ended up doing over and over again because we have a federal chemical regulatory system that has basically failed. It sets up a standard, unlike pharmaceuticals where you do testing and prove something is safe before it goes on the market. For industrial chemicals, they go on the market and then you have to prove that there's a problem with them, which is really hard to do and has proven to be almost impossible. And very few chemicals, I think only 5 in the history of out of the 90,000 plus chemicals that are registered for use in the US have ever been regulated through the scheme they have. So it's just this fundamentally broken system. And Vermont has really been a leader in trying to protect people from toxic chemicals. And there's a number of states who have kind of played that role, and we've been one of them. And it's really driven the market to safer chemicals and safer products. So it's a space that we regulated flame retardants and BPA and lead and mercury, and so some chemicals you might have heard of through the years. And so PFAS chemicals are another place where we need to make progress. And I'll turn it over to Marcie now to talk about what is likely to be in front of you this year.
Yeah, thanks, Lauren. So again, Marcie Gallagher, I think a couple of you I don't know. So I'm VPIRG's environmental associate. I use she, her pronouns. And to reiterate Lauren's point, the US system of regulating chemicals is totally backwards, and it's not like this all over the world. And a lot of times we look to EU's example. They have a much stronger chemical regulatory system. And for that reason, they're much farther ahead of us on PFAS regulation, which ends up being helpful for us because then we can say, oh, well, this product has a safer alternative. A lot of these things that I'll be referencing, we only know because the EU is so much farther ahead of us. So it is really essential to be the first state, or to be one of the first states to do this, because other states will look at this example, and we can't just rely, like Lauren said, on what the federal government has regulated already, or even what they tell us is safe. But up until now, Vermont has really focused specifically for PFAS on downstream contamination, which protects us from these chemicals once they've entered our water and our environment. But in this bill S20, Vermont can restrict PFAS upstream, which would prevent further exposure and contamination by getting it out of our environment before we're even exposed in the first place. And S20 really builds on the work of other states to restrict the use of PFAS and other toxic substances from firefighting foam, food packaging, residential carpets and rugs, and ski wax. And I'm going to briefly go through each of these products and talk about why they're important. So starting off with Class B firefighting foam, the use of this firefighting foam accounts for about 1/3 of total global PFAS pollution. So it's really a big one. There's a lot of good news here. The PFAS-free foam market is well established, it's cost competitive, and most importantly, it's supported by firefighters, and they like to use it. 8 states already have banned or restricted PFAS-containing foam, and 7 states, excluding Vermont, are also considering this this session. So Second product is food packaging, and food packaging is often treated with PFAS for things like water and grease resistance. And this includes types of packaging like sandwich wrappers, popcorn bags, bakery bags, lots of different types of to-go containers. They've all been tested and found to contain PFAS. And this is concerning because when chemicals are used in food packaging, they migrate to our food, which we then ingest into our body. And for that reason, the toxic chemical classes of phthalates and bisphenols are also included in this bill. But for a typical adult, dietary exposure is likely to be the single largest exposure pathway of PFAS. And so the states of Washington, Maine, and New York, and retailers like Panera Bread, Taco Bell, Trader Joe's, and Whole Foods have banned PFAS in food packaging. And most recently, we got the good news that McDonald's announced that they would ban PFAS from their food packaging. The next product category is residential carpets and rugs. This is really a no-brainer because PFAS serve no essential function in carpets and rugs. They're just added for certain stain and water resistant properties, which can be achieved with other materials. And carpets made with PFAS release chemicals over time into the air and dust in our homes. And the exposure to PFAS from rugs and carpets is particularly concerning when you consider what segment of our population spends the most time with their faces in rugs and carpets, which is kids. And the CDC named carpet as the #1 exposure pathway to PFAS for infants and toddlers. So it is really concerning. The good news on this one is that Lowe's and Home Depot have already banned PFAS from the use of residential rugs and carpets sold in their stores. They're industry giants. And Washington and California are restricting PFAS in carpets and carpet treatments sold through administrative processes. And our bill also bans PFAS from aftermarket treatment for rugs and carpets, just to make sure that companies aren't just selling rugs without PFAS only to spray them on right before you buy them. So we just want to close up that loophole. And as with all products containing PFAS, they don't stop causing harm once we're done using them, because when products are disposed of in landfills, the chemicals are then released into the liquid that leaves the landfill or the leachate, and they ultimately make their way into our waterways. So the last product category and the most recently added is ski wax. And this pertains to just some specific high-end wax applied primarily for Nordic ski racing. And it's been proven to contaminate the surrounding environment. So the snow melts and the PFAS trickle down into the soil, into the groundwater. And one of the reasons this came to our attention is because several water systems in Vermont with high level of PFAS were located in ski areas. So this is an area of concern for Vermont specifically. It's very relevant. But there's good news here as well. The intercollegiate Nordic ski teams in the East have banned PFAS wax from their races, and the FIS, which is the sport's international governing body, it oversees Nordic skiing's World Cup. They announced back in late 2019 that they'll begin enforcing a ban on the wax, but still consumers can buy this wax at stores, so we do want to get it off the shelves. And the very last important thing about S20 is that it ensures that we know which children's products contain toxic PFAS. So S20 adds the class of PFAS chemicals to the state's list of chemicals of high concern to children, which was established in Act 188. And adding PFAS to this list will help inform caregivers and public health officials about where toxic PFAS chemicals are being used in products sold in Vermont and marketed to children. So that is the full picture of S20, and happy to take any questions.
All right. Well, let's move on to Jen Duggan from CLF, and we probably will still have a couple minutes for questions before we can get you out of here by 9:45 as promised. Take it away, Jen. Thank you.
Thanks, Lauren. Hi, everyone. So toxic PFAS, or forever chemicals, as they're sometimes referred to, they have been found at unsafe levels across Vermont in our drinking water, surface water, groundwater, in sludges that are applied to our farm fields, and in many other environmental pathways. And these chemicals are a public health perfect storm because they are extremely persistent. They do not break down over time. They also tend to be highly mobile in the environment, so they move and can contaminate, water at a high rate. They can bioaccumulate. They can be toxic in very small concentrations. They're used in hundreds of different industrial and commercial processes, and they're found in a really wide variety of consumer products. And there are more than 9,000 different kinds of these dangerous chemicals in use. They are presumed carcinogens, and they've been linked to a variety of severe health problems, including learning disorders in infants and children, fertility and pregnancy issues, and impaired liver, thyroid, pancreatic, and even immune system function, including a decreased antibody response to vaccines. On top of these serious health threats, a former director of the National Institute of Environmental Health Sciences recently warned that exposure to even small amounts of PFAS may make people more vulnerable to COVID-19. The good news is that in 2019, the Vermont legislature passed a new law to help reduce our exposure to these chemicals in our state, and that law was called Act 21. But there's a critical need for legislative oversight to make sure that the protections under this law are fully realized for Vermonters. One of the primary goals of the law is to ensure that Vermonters have access to safe and clean drinking water that's free from these dangerous forever chemicals. And the statute lays out a two-part process to protect public water supplies. The first is that there was an immediate drinking water standard put in place for 5 PFAS, PFOA, PFOS, PFHXS, PFHPA, and PFNA. And this new standard required public water supplies to test for these chemicals and clean up drinking water if the combined total of these chemicals exceeds 20 parts per trillion. But the legislature recognized that this new standard, which addresses only 5 out of more than 9,000 chemicals, was really only a stopgap measure, and that to truly protect Vermonters from exposure, we need drinking water rules that address all PFAS chemicals in the class. So the law also directs the Agency of Natural Resources to develop new drinking water rules for the entire class or larger groups of PFAS to better protect Vermonters. The agency is required to issue a draft of these new rules by March 1st of this year, unless there's a legal, scientific, or technical reason that prevents the agency from doing so. Despite a really strong legal, scientific, and technical basis for moving forward with stronger drinking water protections for these chemicals, the agency just doesn't appear to be on track. In August, they published a draft determination that it would not develop new drinking water rules. And to support that conclusion, the review that the agency did was really completely inadequate. CLF and our partners pushed back, and we filed extensive legal and technical comments that identify several different options for stronger drinking water protections. If the new rules are not put in place, Vermonters are going to continue to be exposed to unsafe drinking water. Just to give an example of the impact, the initial testing of public water supplies revealed more than 100 systems in Vermont that are contaminated with PFAS. Yet under the current rules, only 8 of these water supplies are required to provide do not drink notice letters to customers and clean up PFAS contamination. Only 8 out of more than 100 contaminated systems will have to take action under the current rules, and that just should not be acceptable to anyone. If we don't move forward with these new rules, it will take decades and will waste a lot of limited resources for the state to chase these dangerous chemicals down one by one, all the while communities are being exposed to unsafe drinking water that has permanent health consequences. While we remain hopeful that the agency will do the right thing and propose stronger drinking water rules on March 1st, we're very concerned given that preliminary determination not to do so. And Vermonters need the legislature to ensure that the agency fully complies with Act 21. There are many other important provisions of Act 21 that I don't have time to cover today, but I'm always happy to talk one-on-one and talk in greater detail to answer any questions that you may have. Thanks so much for your time.